All right. Well, we've been talking about covenant. And last week, the little detour was we focused on uh, covenant people, really. We talked about people versus individuals, and I think we had a good discussion. And so we're sticking with the covenant theme tonight because that's a huge part of the biblical story, the big story that we're looking at. So the biblical narrative. And tonight we have a little bit of a Methodist or Wesleyan emphasis, historically speaking. So the Methodist tradition has upheld holiness as an important aspect of the Christian life, important, really central aspect. And so we're going to take a minute this evening to look at how holiness is related to the covenant people of God. So if you think back, we've read this a couple of times now, Exodus 19, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so we've got a whole people really that are engaged in some sort of priestly function. They represent God to the nations and they go to God on behalf of the nations. That's the idea there. So holiness is really important. And so first the Hebrew word, because we're going to be looking at some Old Testament verses in a minute. The Hebrew word is kodesh, related to the Seder meal. We say the Kaddish, that word Kaddish is related to the word Kodesh. So Kaddish is a way of consecrating. It's a prayer of consecration. And of course, being consecrated to the Lord is an aspect of being holy. We'll talk about ritual purity, just a tiny little bit. The ritual purity for the covenant community symbolizes consecration or holiness. But ritual, I want to emphasize, ritual does not make the person holy. Now there's a cleansing that happens, but the ritual itself is not necessarily what brings about the cleansing, because holiness basically and ultimately is a heart matter. To be holy is to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what it is to be holy. Ritual purity symbolizes that consecration. Now, I may be overstating that a little bit. I'm sure I could find scholars who disagree with me about that. But what I'm just trying to distinguish holiness from a kind of ritual or cultic purity. So that's why the last bullet point, inward intention and outward action align in holiness. We do the right things for the right reasons, coming out of a purified heart. So from the heart flows the action. That's the idea behind holiness. Let's look at some of our favorite Bible verses in Leviticus. Honestly, the more I read the Leviticus, the less strange some of the instructions about sacrifice and all that are, and purity, and and why are these topics in there, that sort of thing. And the more I just generally realize all these laws together, God instructs the people to follow them simply to practice being set apart. I mean, we could think of other reasons, but to be set apart and to do it God's way is holiness. Okay, Leviticus 11, 44 and 45. We're going to see how often
He says
the Lord says, I am holy and you shall be holy, right? 11, 44 and 45. Somebody read that for us.
For I am the Lord your God. Sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming creature that moves on the earth, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy.
Okay, so if we dug into the context, like what's the matter with swarming creatures, right? That's kind of one of the first questions that comes to mind. And why is that connected to holiness? Well, we could do some study on that and come up with an answer, but it's going to be a partial answer. And the main idea is, for whatever the reason is for not, being made unclean by swarming creatures, God is calling these people as a people to be holy.
Well, and it's connected to their leaving Egypt. Like, is it a comment about the place?
It could be. Yeah, that's a very good first kind of thought. Yeah. Right. So, and behind that, it might be a kind of a reference to, don't go back to the idolatrous ways that we left in Egypt. That's a big theme, of course, all the way through the Old Testament. All right. Leviticus 19:2.
It says creeping things.
So is mine.
Speak to all the congregation of the Israelites and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.
Okay, and here it's connected to honoring your father and mother, and then it talks about sacrifice, and then it talks about reaping the harvest. And if we read on there, reaping the harvest, you don't glean the corners, right? You leave the corners for the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner, or the alien, or the stranger in the land. So you can start to see, if we just think out just a little bit, these are instructions God gives, and if the people obey them, then they really are demonstrating a very kind of countercultural way of living that we could regard as holiness. Leviticus 20, verse 26.
And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine.
Okay, separated, right? Consecrated, separated.
Higher standard.
I think in some ways a higher standard, right? Where we as a people will not engage in some of the behaviors the surrounding nations engage in, right? Now, some things we do, but some of these behaviors, for example, if you look at verse 27, a man or a woman who's a medium or a wizard shall be put to death, right? There's none of that kind of activity among God's people.
Okay, so separated from the peoples, people singular, people plural?
Plural. Mine says peoples, plural. So does yours?
No, that's what mine does too, but like groups of nations or
Right.
families or what?
Not families.
My version says nations.
Yeah, nations. But again, we have to be careful not to think of these fully developed modern nations, right? These are like people groups.
Like tribes.
Yeah, or clans of, big clans of people. Yeah.
And says other peoples.
Yeah, other peoples, right. All right, 21:8, Leviticus 21:8.
You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy.
Okay. So we see the repetition here. You be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. So, driving home the point that these people somehow, by the way they worship and the way they live, the way they relate to each other, and the way they're not like the other nations in certain pretty clear ways, they're representing God. They're demonstrating something about God's goodness, justice, mercy, all that. And they're learning in these activities what God is like. Now, if we spent some time with looking at the various sacrifices, quite a number of the sacrifices are means for people to be reconciled to God. So God has made a way to demonstrate his mercy, right? So we learn that God's a merciful God. Of course, we read that all through the Bible. But in these kind of day-to-day practices and the various instructions they get, the festivals they keep, the kind of corporate life they have together, they're learning something about God and then what it means to represent God to the people. Now let's go to First Peter. And
This
yeah.
last section was specifically to the priests. They are to be, so they're, you've got a holy people, but then you've got this subgroup
right.
that is to a higher standard, and a higher standard fee.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think about, so you have this priestly people, but then you have the priests within this priestly people. And I think just basically that the priests, when the people look at the priests, they're to remember what their calling is. Now, the priests are authorized to do certain things, right? So they have a specific function. And that is a way of reinforcing the peculiarity of these people, right? There are boundaries. There are protective steps that have to be taken to protect their holiness. And the priests help to sort of make that a visible reality every day. All right, 1 Peter 1. Peter is going to quote Leviticus, 1 Peter 1:16, and then we'll look at 13 through 16.
Well, 16 is where it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy.
Exactly right. And he's quoting Leviticus, right? Quoting Leviticus. So he's not, Peter is not just going back and cherry picking a verse in Leviticus because it fits whatever it is he wants to say. Actually, he's saying to the people, First Peter is also quoting Exodus 19, 5 through 8. If you look at First Peter chapter 2, 9 and 10, or 8 and 9, you see, so in Peter's mind, the people of God that he's speaking to, and these, this kind of Jewish Christian diaspora scattered around, this is a continuation of the people of God. So from our theme about story, the story is continuing, and it's a kind of an example to us that, in a way, what Peter is saying to these people in the first century, these words from Leviticus are for you. They're addressed to the people of that time, but they're really for all of us who are part of the people of God. So we can practice realizing that even the book of Leviticus, God speaks to us through the book of Leviticus. Now let's look at 13 through 16. Who would read that?
I'll
Lisa?
read it.
Oh, go ahead.
Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct.
Good.
Because it is written, be holy, for I am holy.
Right. Now, and you're reading the New American Standard?
No, it's New King James.
Oh, that's New King James. Okay. All right. Now, if we had the time, we could look around in First Peter, because why is Peter talking about girding up the loins of your mind or prepare your minds for action? These aren't just kind of standalone ethical guidelines he's giving. He's actually telling the people to be prepared for some suffering that they may already be experiencing and likely are to experience more. So one kind of modern example that comes to my mind is that back during the 60s in the civil rights movement era, across the South in these black churches, African American churches, the people who were going to march would get together in these churches and practice not reacting to the, to the reviling and the violence that they would almost certainly experience when they went out and started marching. And they literally would, practice yelling in each other's faces and cussing each other out, maybe not cussing, but using words that are offensive. And in First Peter, he's encouraging the people to do the same kind of thing. Be ready for the troubles that you may be experiencing now or that clearly loom large on the horizon. So we could think about that as, again, this isn't just a moral instruction for us. It's a way of thinking about what sort of struggles do we face, and are we a little bit too comfortable maybe because people aren't scorning us because we follow Jesus, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud with you. Okay. We've already covered that. The context in each of these passages we looked at tell us how to express holiness. And I've tried to emphasize that already. Now, we're still talking about covenant problems with the people keeping the covenant. And this is where themes that we've covered stay with us. So sin is a problem all the way through the Bible. Sin is always lurking. Sin is always ready to confuse, to distract, to tempt, to lure away. So we keep that in mind. And I'm borrowing now from Ben Witherington in his book, Biblical Theology. Sins are not viewed as merely social problems between human beings. They are viewed as a violation of one's covenant relationship with God, and one is answerable to God as well as human beings. So God will act to protect this covenant. And when we sin, it's actually, at least in an implicit or indirect way, an attack on the covenant that we have with God. That's very important. We're not studying this topic I'm about to mention in this study, but on Sunday mornings, we're about to talk about some really difficult Old Testament material, like why does it seem like God commands genocide? For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 7. We're going to get into this on Sunday mornings. But one of the things that's really emphasized that I think doesn't necessarily come through in just the way we're doing it, but it's like this covenant between God and the people is really, really sacred. And God expects the people to keep the covenant. So there's a kind of, when God says, I'm a jealous God, right? God is going to protect that covenant and these people from external negative influence. And so, there could be not good consequences that happen because the people wander away.
Did you say that one more time? God protects his people against, I didn't understand.
Outside negative influences, or what's in the heart, right? Because that's all the way through the Bible too. God protects them, yeah. So when they go into the promised land, this is kind of where we're going on Sunday morning. When they go into the promised land, for a long time, scholars referred to their going into the promised land as conquest, like they go in and they conquer the land. That's really not what the scriptures are saying at all. It's actually more of a defensive kind of thing. And that's what I mean by, God's acting to protect his people. Yeah.
It's really easy to see how sinning against another person is sinning against God. Because, they too are made in God's image.
Right.
So when it's like, I don't find that difficult it's, when the psalmist says, against you only have I sinned.
Right.
Like after Bathsheba.
Yeah,
I mean, it
after
looks like
committing
there are
adultery and murder, yeah.
It's like some other people got sinned
Right.
against. But
Right,
anyway, it's easy to see that.
yeah. Only as in, and especially as in ultimately, when I sin against another human being, I'm sinning against God. Yeah. Okay. So God's people represent God in the world in contrast to other peoples and their deities. And so covenant is not just some sort of agreement, it's deeply personal. It's really about the people's relationship with God. And that, again, that instructs us, right? I mean, personal faith, our personal faith is part of that covenant. Our church community, our congregations, we together have a relationship with God. And I'm not sure that comes across as forcefully as it should. Okay. I borrowed something from Wikipedia and I shortened it. But let's think for a moment about, kind of gathering together all these loose threads, so to speak, about how all these different laws and instructions help to give us the general picture of holiness related to the covenant. There are moral laws. There are social laws. So in very mundane ways, when somebody among the people of God have a property dispute, that's not just a legal matter to work out. It's a kind of a theological challenge to act in godly ways while you're working out the legal dispute. There are food laws. There are purity laws. There's a whole bunch of feasts. I took several out: Day of Atonement, Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and so on. Unleavened bread. Okay, there are sacrifices and offerings, a whole bunch of them: sin offering, guilt offering, burnt offering, wave offering or heave offering, offering of well-being or thanksgiving, and so on. Lots of different sacrifices and offerings. And then there are instructions for the priesthood and the high priest. And all together, I'm saving that last one. All together, they help the covenant people understand what it means to be holy. And I will editorialize just a tad here. We United Methodists, maybe not so much other Methodist denominations, but we certainly have sort of lost track of what it means to be a holy people. And if we could turn the clock back, Methodists used to be known as holiness people. There's something called the holiness movement that would be fun to talk about, but not now. Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
Steve,
Yes.
earlier you talked about holiness coming from the heart,
Uh-huh.
I think. And as I look at this list, these are all actions.
Aha.
There's
Yes,
there's no heart involved here.
Oh, yeah.
it's a great observation. And the heart connection is assumed when you enter into a covenant agreement. You are transparently saying, I will keep the terms of the covenant. I will be faithful to you. But you're right, Jim. In the laws, so to speak, they don't. You can't see the motive. You can't see the heart. Now, if we
But
dug
they-
into, yeah, go ahead, Ann.
The actions flow out of the heart.
Right. That's
So
assumed.
the reason you're tempted to do all those things is because your heart's not right. It's not love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your
Right.
might, and etc.
Right. Yeah.
You're, but I agree with that, that's what you would hope would be going on. But it would seem to me that it would be possible for someone to outwardly appear to be keeping all of these things and following the laws, and yet not have holiness in their heart, if they were doing it for what the neighbor's going to say.
Oh, that's possible, and it's common.
Those are the
I mean, you're
hypocrites.
right. Yeah.
Well, but it goes back to the motivation for that, because I was thinking about this. I mean, that God's people represent God in the world.
Yeah.
That's what I was taught would be the motivation for being good. I mean, all of those
Yeah.
things.
Right. Because you're representing God.
Yeah.
Otherwise it falls into legalism.
Mhm.
Right. And that's,
Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the holiness movement had a problem with holier than thou, right? With self-righteousness. But back to Jim's observation there, I would say that over time, sooner or later, if you're keeping these laws only outwardly, eventually your heart's going to show through in some kind of action that you sort of reveal yourself as you're just going through the motions, right?
Well,
I mean, goodness, all the Pharisees who probably followed the
pastors.
laws
Yeah.
were, truly wanted to kill the Messiah
Right.
when he showed up.
Right.
So like, I don't think that's the opposite of holiness, I guess.
But to draw it a little closer to home, I want to say this just to qualify what I'm about to say. So there are good boundaries of propriety. Or another way of saying it is we don't all have to hang out our dirty laundry in front of everybody all the time. Right? But one of the problems with church life is that we tend to hide our struggles.
Yeah.
We
Mhm.
want,
Yeah.
we used to dress up, right? People don't dress up anymore, so it's not so much related to that. But you want to look your best. You want your kids to behave properly. You want all that, and it's easy then, and that's all good. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's easy to just take that next step. And if I'm really struggling, if I'm having financial difficulty, if I am struggling with alcohol, if I'm anything like that, it's really hard in conventional church life for people to be honest. And they don't have to be honest with everybody, but even with one or two or in a small group, we have a hard time with this.
Lie about it.
Mhm.
Maybe.
Okay, well, the motive is not always clear. And the whole issue of hypocrisy,
Yeah.
legalism, I mean, that's that knife edge. It's so easy to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's my Baptist background is one too.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've told this story and I'm telling it on us. So Joni and I, when we were first married, we argued a lot about what on time is, right? And I was pastoring. Linda, we're driving to Alney for church. So I used to be Linda's pastor a long time ago. That's why I'm addressing Linda. Anyway, so Joni was sort of then, she's not that way anymore, but at then, it's kind of like 10 minutes late is still on time. Just kind of like that. Well, I'm hyper responsible and I need to be there so I can greet people and talk with people before church, because I can't after church because we're running out headed to Florence for the other service. It was a 2-point charge. So we're on the way to church. We're on the way to Olney to church, and we get in just this roaring argument.
Over what the definition.
Yeah. And I remember saying, in 15 minutes, I'm going to have to be all spiritual and look like everything's
It's your fault.
I was feeling it, man. I was feeling it.
Hey, Joni, I would like to schedule some off-time conversation for you to tell Glenna how you got out of that mode.
Oh,
Whoa.
I tell you one thing, this isn't gonna help Glenna any, but part of it is my children grew up.
Yeah, kids.
Yeah.
Kids were, I couldn't figure out how to get everybody herded in the same direction at the same time. Yeah, but.
I don't know that that's such a bad trait, Joni. I was just the opposite. I would be so focused on at least being on time, if not early, that I would have migraines from it.
Yeah.
So it took me a long time to think, well, the world's not going to end over 3 minutes.
Well, honestly, when we travel, like if we have to catch a flight to go someplace, if they want you there an hour and a half early, I want to be 2 hours early because I don't want any stress. And that's a little silly. Sometimes, Joni says, relax, we're going to be fine. Yeah. Okay. Now, we have a holy people, right? Let's keep this in mind. Part of the story, God has formed a covenant with this particular group of people, and he chose them not because they were big and flashy and powerful. In fact, they were not. But we're going to start out of this covenant relationship. We're going to start looking forward now to when Israel demands a king. And already in the Pentateuch, in the book of Deuteronomy and elsewhere, there are hints that people are going to not be happy not having a king like the other nations. Now that like the other nations is important. On the one hand, it makes a lot of sense to us if having a king will seemingly do a better job in, shall we say it, national defense. But it's really a way of saying we don't really trust God to do that, right? God is our king. We don't really trust God to do the things that we need kings to do. And so we want a king like the other nations. And these other nations, remember, some of them are bloodthirsty empires, and some of them are pretty cruel and violent, and they're all, polytheistic, idol worshiping peoples. So we want to be like them, right? It's a way of saying we don't want to be like the kind of people you're trying to make us to be. God promises the land as part of the covenant. So let's look at these. Genesis 12. Somebody read that, verse 7. Part of the covenant, remember, God promises them a land. Genesis 12:7.
Okay, Genesis 12:7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him.
Okay, and we remember Abram is kind of sojourning around in the promised land. And God says, I'm going to give your people, your offspring, this land. Okay, Exodus 33:1. We can hurry through these. Who's got Exodus 33:1? And somebody else look at Deuteronomy 11:31.
Then the Lord said to Moses, Depart and go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, To your descendants I will give it.
Okay, there's the repetition of the covenant promise for this land. Okay, who has Deuteronomy 11:31? Joni, translate it. She's reading Italian, so I'm going to make her translate.
Okay, you all, in fact, will, in a little while, will pass over the Jordan and go and take possession of the land that God, your God, has given you.
Right. Yeah, so in this part of the story, now they're on the east side of the Jordan, and Moses is basically giving his valedictory address. He's not going into the promised land, but they're getting ready to cross over into the promised land. And then we get Joshua 1, 3, and 4, which I will read. Every place, this is after the death of Moses, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west, that's the Mediterranean, shall be your territory. It's quite a large land. And we could have looked at other verses. So this promise of land in relation to covenant people is a major part of the picture. Now I'm going to touch on this. This is the thing we're going to get into on Sunday mornings. I got to touch on it. When Israel enters into the land, is it a conquest? And these days, and for a good long while now, scholars have said it's not really a conquest. You know, a much earlier generation of scholars referred to it that way. They used the term holy war. It's not really a holy war. That holy war never shows up in the Old Testament. Now, Yahweh war or divine war does. And it's very clear that God goes to battle for his people. But it's not, it's much less conquest. And here's why the scholars say that. And this is where we get into a little of the historical background. We're going to look at a map in just a second. The land of Canaan, which is, we'll just call that what we know as Israel. In that whole land, the best guess estimate for population is less than 100,000 people in the whole area.
During this period.
During this period, right, when they're getting ready to enter the land. So what you're talking about is they're really going into a mostly open land. Where did the people live? They lived along the coast, naturally, or they lived along the major trade routes. And there were two of them, the Via Maris, which is the way of the sea, and the King's Highway. Oh, I want to come back to that, but let's look at this map. Now, I drew these lines, so don't throw any shade at me, okay? All right. In the middle of the picture, if you can follow my cursor, here's the Jordan River. So the people come up from the Sinai Peninsula around the Dead Sea, and right up in here, kind of across from Jericho, this is where they camp out to get ready to go in. And they go in, and then we read in the book of Joshua about these battles. They battle with Jericho, and they battle with Ai, which they shouldn't have done, and they, these other places. But these two lines I've drawn, this black line on the left of the picture over by the Mediterranean Sea is the Via Maris.
Oh.
That's about where it would go. Now this is my estimation. Just, I could not find a map that had what I wanted on it. So I just made this. Or the other one, this other black line is the King's Highway,
Which follows the river.
yeah, right. It's, it's kind of in the area that would be a little more traversable. You can see these are mountains here. You'd like to avoid, up and down and around and up and down and around as much as you can. All right, where did the people settle? Most of the people lived along these trade routes and, of course, by the sea, literally close to the sea. So all this land in here, you can see the mountains here. These are called the southern highlands or hill country, the central hill country, and so on. This is the area where Israel began to settle. Now, some of them settled on the east side of the Jordan River. But that area, which is generally just open territory. Now that I'm just passing on. I'm like the parrot today, passing on. Sorry, still looking at the map. What I've read from the scholars, the historians, the archaeologists, and so they're really we're talking about the mid 13th century BC up to late 13th century. This area that we're looking at was still controlled by Egypt at the period of time that the children of Israel start settling in that land. And they're basically going into open areas. Now we read in the Bible about these battles. So, I'm not taking those away, but it's not like they're just throwing people out right and left. And, so then that raises the question, which is not this study, but another one. Why does the Bible make it sound as if it's just one battle after another all the time in the book of Joshua? And that's a question that could be asked, and we'd have to answer it another time.
And the people's names, the Hittites, the Perizzites,
right.
The Jebusites,
right.
the
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, yeah. Somebody have a thought? Oh, I thought I heard somebody. Okay. So now this leads to a question, because especially these days with the increasing prominence of Christian nationalism, I want to be careful here. There are different kinds of Christian nationalism, so there's a range of ways of thinking there. But some Christians believe that the Bible justifies this kind of conquest warfare and a kind of privileging of Christian people to hold office and basically to control non-Christian people. And I asked this question, can we say that the Bible justifies conquest, warfare, and nationalism? And if you read, if you read parts of the story and you don't read carefully with a kind of awareness of other parts of the story, you can get the idea, yeah, God commanded this, and this is our time and all that. And so some people believe it can be justified, a little bit like slavery was justified for a long time. The Bible says it's okay, or the Bible even commands it. Now, this raises a question directly related to what we're trying to do in this class, and that is to think about the story over time. We're talking about history, the history of God's people over time. And so here's a case of remembering that in the New Testament, when we read about Jesus and his life and what he teaches us, his death and resurrection, we are learning something in a kind of climactic way about the nature of God. So the God of the Old Testament is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So Jesus revealing the true nature of God tells us something about God. And that creates some tension, right? Because what we read from Jesus doesn't seem to fit in what we see in Joshua or Judges or, these parts of the book. So I introduced a concept here called progressive revelation. And that is, we're watching God walk with us in history. So God is mysteriously willing to operate in this sinful world to accomplish his purposes. I could say it this way: God takes the risk to accomplish his will inside human history. And that means God is willing to get involved in ways that we, it kind of produces questions for us, maybe even morally troubling kinds of questions. This raises lots of questions. Does God have the right to destroy a nation? And would he be just in doing so? Joanne.
And I just, a
Yeah.
contemporary example, I just finished reading a couple of books about the Native Americans, specifically the Comanches
Yeah.
in southeast or southwest United States. And, they were remarkable people. The people that suffered, that they caused to suffer was really pretty significant. And we can look back and we can admire their tenacity, their horsemanship, their all of that.
Right.
But when, the Sioux comes down, they kill them, it's just,
Yeah.
so what ends up is, even if you want to go as far as manifest destiny, when the white man comes and takes over, except for smallpox, but
Yeah.
generally speaking, the people end up in a much better. So they're healthier, they're not starving. There's a lot of goodness that we
Yeah.
would call good that comes out of that. Whereas if you just look from the one side that these people are coming in and
Yeah.
destroying or taking over the land,
Right.
well, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
It's always complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it is,
It's not-
but looking at the Levant,
Mm-hmm.
does God have the right?
Well, this is the difficult theological question, and we are allowed to have a partial answer. But Anne.
Well, it says, I can't quote where it is, but God says that there's something about the sins of the people in the pagans in that land have come up to a particular level that he has to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that God hates sin. No matter whether you're pagan or you're Jewish or, among God's people or Christian, he just hates sin, period.
Right.
And you can either do it his way or be judged.
Yeah.
And I
So
think this is a judgment of the pagan people. It has nothing to do really with the Jews other than God's using them.
Yeah. But it doesn't, this is not like an eternal principle that, that one group of people can go to war with another group of people just because in this part of the Bible, God is going to war with people, right? It's not some sort of abstract principle we can use as a way of teaching us what we should do now.
Never.
No, it isn't.
No, I'm not saying never. I'm just saying we can't, we can't just have a kind of blanket, well, it's in the Bible, so I can do it, that sort of thing. And I think it's a real challenge to think, you know what, God can do what he wants. God can do what he wants. And
I think our difficulty with that is understanding his agency.
Yeah.
God can do what he wants. He normally works through
right
agents.
That's the acting in history,
Right. And that's hard sometimes to see God in that.
It is. I think this is part of the story that presses us, a little bit to figure out. Now, this is why we keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, God is eternally triune. So even here, in the parts of the story we don't necessarily feel really comfortable with, that's the God we see active. And I can't explain everything I'm thinking about that, right? The other thing we should keep in mind is God allowed his own people to be destroyed.
Well, even his own people, were really no better off than everybody else.
That's
It's
right.
almost like, well, you gotta start somewhere. So I'm gonna take this guy and his family and we'll start there. But like, they weren't stellar human beings.
No.
Well, that was what I was thinking, well, oh, why that people?
Mhm.
When we were in Israel, that's one of the things I kept thinking, why this place? Out of all of the places
Right.
in God's creation, why this place?
Yeah, it's not the garden spot of the world. I mean, the Galilee is very fertile land, but most of,
That's where all the and all that.
yeah, most of Israel is pretty dry and hilly, and even some of it's desert-like. So, okay, well, let's press on a little bit. The people want a king. So let's look at 1 Samuel 8. And if the judge's time that's very volatile. There is no king. Everybody did what's right in his own eyes. So it's pretty chaotic. And then they want a king. Let's look at what it says in 1 Samuel 8.
I'm sorry.
Okay, verses 4 and 5. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways." So see, they have good reason, they think. "Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." Now verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So here it's like God is making an accommodation. Here we see a sovereign God willing to work with the agency of these people.
But how did
Jeremiah, yeah,
the period of the judges work out for them, though? If that was, I mean, if God was supposed to be their king, and I'm not questioning this, I'm just thinking about this. If God's supposed to be their king, that the people certainly during the period of the judges weren't loyal and didn't fail to sin and all that stuff. So I mean,
Yeah.
there's one thing after another. I mean, the judges came and went, and
right,
very little stability.
right. Yeah, they constantly wandered off. The judges, the structure of the book of Judges is this kind of cyclical.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
judge comes forward, gets them back on track. They worship the Lord. They're faithful. Then they begin to slip away and they fall into sin, and then they get attacked by these other nations. That's the cycle there. And why does God allow it? I mean, this is like the perennial question. Why does God allow these bad things to happen? And there's no 100% satisfying answer. I don't have one.
Because I mean, if the other people were attacking the Israelites, it was in order to punish them or show them that they're doing wrong or whatever it is. But it's never worked. If
Right.
that was the strategy.
The strategy of God as king?
No, I mean, trying to punish the people or bring the people back to God, and it may have happened for short periods of time, but right away they would go back to doing
Right.
sinful things.
Yeah. So the sheer fact of punishment isn't really changing anything long
Right.
term.
I mean, yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. We all know about King David. I'm going to jump ahead here because we're trying to keep the story going. So David is, God picks David. God didn't really, I mean, he picked Saul, but Saul was sort of okay, I don't really, I'm accommodating. You want a king? Okay, here's Saul. But it says in 1 Samuel 16 that the Lord chooses David. And remember, he's the last son. He's number 8 of all these other sons. And God is very much guiding Samuel to pick David. So David is God's choice. Right. Now let's just look at, so all these script, we will look at these next week, but I'm trying to kind of wrap it up here. Let's look at Matthew 1 verse 1. What does it say there?
See?
The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
Right. And these scriptures that we'll look at next week are all prophecies or a promise. 2 Samuel is actually a promise that the lineage of David will endure. So we're moving, we're advancing quickly. I just want us to think for a second that the rest of the Old Testament, the books of history, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, tells the story of the nation and their kings. And the prophets prophesy against injustice, against idolatry. But within the prophets then comes this vision. There is one coming in the lineage of David, and that's kind of the setup. We'll take time next week to look at it. But again, I'm asking us to think of it in terms of the narrative. We're now advancing. I'm thinking about Galatians 4:4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, right? So we're advancing the story a little bit. So from around 1210 BC to 586 BC, that's the nation. They're destroyed in 586. The story of God's interactions with his people, all through the books of the Bible that we know associated with those times. They reject him as king. They're destroyed. And then there's the promise of a new covenant. We'll look at this next week. Jeremiah 31 through 34. So we're coming to we're hurrying toward really the moment that God finally fully enters into human experience in the Son, right? And that's a major event in this big story that we're telling. All right. So we will meet next week. We won't meet the next week. And then on the 26th, we'll be back together and we'll see how we're doing by then. All right, friends, we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.